I'm Kathleen Murphy, and I have to say I'm really actually excited to see you because so many of you, I bother you with surveys about KT fairly often, so it's nice to see the faces that go with all the emails and the names. And we've thought a lot about online versus face-to-face workshops at our Centers for KT, and so we've tried to build in some activities this morning that actually take advantage of all of you being here in the same room. So thanks for doing the pretest, because we do take those seriously as well. For example, that's why we're having a longer break in the middle. Some people requested that last year. And I know everyone always likes interactivity, so if you have ideas, the post-test has a thing on the back where, any way we can improve it, we want to make this a good experience for you all. So what I'm going to talk about with you for the next hour is talking about the research that we did do at the Center for Knowledge Translation for Employment Research, and that's the one that we have with our partners here from VCU. This is also a workshop of the Center for KT on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, which serves all of you. So one thing that NIDLR tasked us with doing as part of the research trajectory of the KTER Center was to do a couple of systematic reviews so that we figured out what is good evidence to embed into a KT project, and then identify with 4 mandated audiences what the barriers and facilitators might be to the use of their research, and then figure out how to select a strategy and do a kind of preliminary test. This isn't, well, actually you all did do an RCT at VCU, but these are small scale kind of research projects looking at what might work, what might be good ideas with given audiences. So I just talked about that. That's what we did. So we identify the evidence, describe the factors, test the effectiveness. Those were like in the priority, our R1, R2, R3, our goals next. So the way that we, again, we're tasked to figure out what would be good evidence to do. We did systematic reviews, which I know some of you have been coming to our workshops over the years, and those are really comprehensive literature searches that follow a strict protocol. And then we had 4 mandated target audiences: vocational rehabilitation professionals, people with disabilities, employers/business. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Policymakers, and then figured out the testing. Okay, next. So to get a little more granular and give you an overview of what we did, the 2 systematic reviews that we did do one was on cancer and looking at what programs in the workplace promote effective employment outcomes for cancer survivors. The second one, I have the expert sitting right here. Carolyn Graham is the lead author. They did a review on, do you want to explain it?
It's traumatic brain injury in working age adults. And we were looking only at those interventions that the outcome was competitive employment.
Okay, so the point of doing those, as I say, was what are you going to talk about in your KT strategies? Then all this R2, R2.1, 2, 3, 4, was to figure out, all right, what are the barriers and facilitators in these different audiences, and thinking about how are we going to bound these populations, what are good ways to do outreach to them as far as thinking through what kinds of data collection activity might they participate in. So because it was exciting, you can know there is a stated population of who works at a VR agency or not. We were able to survey them, and again, Carolyn is a great person if you have any questions about that survey data, because we developed the instrument together using, I don't know if you know Carol Esterbrook's work, Estabrooks. She is a Canadian KT scholar and works in the field of nursing, and she had developed a survey on barriers to the use of evidence and facilitators for nurses. So we took that and worked with her a bit and adapted it. Then we thought, well, policymakers, they're probably not going to do a survey. It might not even get to them. They're not going to talk in a focus group because of confidentiality issues. It's hard to schedule them all together. So let's just do one-on-one interviews and do a small, in-depth sample and really talk to key stakeholders in disability and employment policy. So we did 25 of those. The business people that we talked to, VCU led the recruitment for that. We worked a lot with the U.S. Business Leadership Network, and I think your local roundtable, right? The VCU roundtable? Yeah. The Virginia roundtable, yeah. And also VCU led the recruitment for focus groups with people with disabilities, and these were held over the phone. So again, that promoted confidentiality, more convenient for people. So what I'm going to focus on for the first part of this is some of the findings from the focus groups with members of the business community, and we're going to walk through it together. So remember, our job here was to figure out through these focus groups what helps them, promote the use, what promotes the use of evidence, or in some cases you had to think, well, let's broaden this a little bit. What do people mean by evidence? How do they get information? Maybe we could embed evidence through those existing information channels. And then what are the facilitators? And sometimes it's the same thing. It can be like a double-edged sword, and you'll see what I mean by that. So Valerie, a.k.a. Vicki Brooke, is sitting right here. Caddy couldn't be with us, and Carolyn Graham, so they actually conducted the focus group. So again, feel free to, if you have any questions about that, they're the experts sitting here. And, it's the typical focus groups, right? Conversational. Next. So just who did we end up talking to? It was primarily women, 70% women, around 50. These were kind of management level people, mostly white, but not all, 70% white and a mixture of other races, and mostly college, 70% college. So it wasn't like a bunch of PhDs. We really did get business people. Okay, next. We had a mix of this is where they worked, their employer size that they reported to us. So you can see it's about 40-40, large and small, and then 20% in the middle, medium. Next. Okay, so the analysis was pretty involved. So we did do verbatim transcripts, and then we had everybody read that. We came up with a taxonomy of topics. Then we had, myself and my research assistant went through and coded all the transcripts in NVivo so we could run specific topical reports. We did some reliability testing. Not formal, but sitting down and looking at where there was different interpretations, and put it in NVivo. And then, as I mentioned, the whole thing was to figure out, okay, given the barriers, given the facilitators employing this framework, we're going to talk about the theoretical domains framework. How should you try to get some information out to the business community? What would be a good way? Next. So, this is the framework we employed. It's called the Theoretical Domains Framework. You have the article there in your red folder if you're interested. And the lead author is French. So the first question, who needs to do what differently, we felt that's really somewhat given to us by NIDR, that it has to be somehow something that is employers and members of the business community, and we need to get them to use some kind of work that comes out of our systematic reviews. So I'm not really going to focus too much on that today, but instead let's think about using this theoretical framework, which barriers and enablers need to be addressed. So what I'm going to go to do now, here's like interactive part. I'm going to show you different slides of our focus group themes, and I want you to think through using the paper in front of you if you want, because that'll help you work together. We're going to stop, and I'm going to give you a few minutes to look at the slide and think to yourself, given that information, and I had to figure out what kind of KTE strategy to design for members of the business community, would I think of this information as contributing to a barrier or a facilitator or both? Do you have any questions about? Maybe if we go to the next slide, it'll become clearer. Okay, so I mentioned to you where it's supposed to be that we're using evidence, right? But what does that mean to your audience, right? So first we wanted to think through, what does evidence-based practice mean to you? what do you think? When you talk about research, what is research, right? So some people talked about it being it's information gathering, so there's formal research, but then, if I just poke around on the internet, that's me doing some research. So then there's primary research versus analysis of secondary data sets. I think we have a few experts in the room about that. Or using census data is often something, or Bureau of Labor Statistics data, they would call that research. They would call their own market research, that's research. And then here's a quote, really this is, I think, what NIDR wanted us to embed in our strategies is the results of particularly NIDR-funded scientific process. So here's a definition, I think, closest to ours. The practice has been tested in a therapeutic or scientific process by which outcomes have been able to be measured and charted so that the practice is known to be an effective practice. So I'm going to stop for a minute. You have your flip chart and your Sharpies. So if you want to just look at this for a second and think through, given the ambiguity of what people think is research, would you consider this a barrier or a facilitator?
This process.
If you had to use this data to help inform the selection of a KT strategy, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe you would just say, this is completely irrelevant to what I need to do. But just kind of think through it a little bit, and if you could work together and use the chart. I'm going to give you some other, I don't know if this is additional kind of themes that help you think through this particular aspect of figuring out what people think about research or evidence-based practice. Sometimes people talked about best practices. We created our own evidence, I guess, by what our program and project is, but wouldn't mean I wouldn't be interested in seeing research from other areas. Some people considered that it was any kind of practice or information or intervention that had been tested, proven, measurable, effective, successful. And these are actual things people said. If you say it in a quote, it's an utterance. So in general, people, the employers, the business people we talked to said, but yeah, sure, research is important, but they really didn't, there wasn't like a clear set thing about what they were talking about. So I don't know if just briefly, has anybody got like a burning thought that they want to share with everyone? So is there anything that is different from what has been on the slide that anybody wants to share now, or we can move on? Jess?
We came to the conclusion that it can be a barrier unless the research for some some portions of the business-oriented community, it would be a barrier unless you can connect it to real-world experience.
Mm-hmm. Especially the experience of their own company.
Exactly. I'm thinking of the Walgreens CEO who just said, I can't wait for the research to tell me this will work. I'm just going to do it.
Yes. I'm smiling because I'm thinking of a particular project I'm involved in with companies that will remain unnamed. Yes, and researchers are not necessarily super popular as presenters or with the business community. It depends. But okay, so we asked then, well, not me, but the people at this table asked the employers, well, have you used research? How do you use it in decision-making, if at all? So these are ways that we found, Stephen and I going through and picking through all the transcripts, okay, yeah, they actually are using something that fits this very kind of vague definition of, but maybe you would call that research, okay? So to use to promote or support an approach to service. We assess current, past research and other guidelines and resources, along with relevant literature to give us the best high-quality care to both of our patients and employees. So you can see this is a medically based employer. To document that our product is effective using clinical studies. We see that all the time in advertising, have been done of how beneficial our product is to a person's health. Using market research, trying to develop a marketing plan to analyze potential demand for a market or service. To prove our reason for focusing on disabled sick consumers, as I see there after disabled. To benchmark industry standards, especially in relation to salaries. To select vendors. Let me just see what else we got here. So again, thinking through that, if your audience, this is how they might want to use research, we're going to stop again, and you can think through doing just what we did again. So here's more data from your target audience. This is how they tell you if I am going to use research at all, and to Jess's point, maybe I never would if it seems irrelevant to my company, but if I am, these are ways I might use it. So if you had to market some kind of research-based finding of yours to, in this case, a business community, would this information help you figure out a strategy or not? Is it a barrier or a facilitator? So I'm just going to go give you a little bit more information about what would make employers use research. And this is probably pretty unsurprising. It would be when it's to comply with a mandate, right? Sometimes it's not related to profitability, but it's a mandate and you're trying to figure out how to comply with it. This was related to building a hydropower station. An employer researches how to handle an applicant that comes and has a disability. Maybe when they research how to handle that, they come across the ADA legislation or the, something to do with a legal mandate. So also larger employers tend to use research more, partly because they have the resources in-house to do it. Okay, and they have to be more compliance-oriented, right? Mm-hmm. So in larger organizations I've worked, there are bigger, very costly decisions. They impact a great number of people. There's more of a regulatory environment. So you can't just do things off the seat of your pants if you're a small business. It has to be, someone is going to be scrutinizing that. It's mission critical that the decisions are data-driven, so it gets more formal. So given that, thinking through your target audience and what makes them use research or not. So just wanted to give you a little more information about what makes them use research and things that we're thinking. Okay, so we're going to finish up this part. Then there's going to be another set about how they use research that relates to people with disabilities, since that's the theme of this workshop. And then talking about how time is an issue. So we've got 2 more stops, but I'll just give you another minute. Or do you need another minute to talk about company size and this compliance mandate? Or you want to move on? Okay, so let's move on to the really why we're all here, right? So how is research use related to people with disabilities? Some people want to know about a specific population, right? In this case, it was veterans with post-traumatic stress syndrome. People are interested in figuring out what assistive technologies are research-based, figuring out how to make web-based products accessible, huge issue coming up, especially with the cloud, and hiring, and figuring out what is the best way, research-based ways to train employees. Next slide. And a lot of people were aware of the Burton-Blatt study, which showed that an accommodation on average costs less than $500, and probably a lot of people in this room are aware of that study or have heard that figure. That there's research about how it can benefit company climate, having employees with disabilities. But people sometimes said, oh, but that's such an old study, we need new research, and they weren't aware that actually the Burton-Blatt Institute goes back and updates that study. So is there anything, I know you all have been having great discussions, and I know you've been kind of exploring a lot of themes in your discussions. Do you want to stop now and talk specifically about this theme related to people with disabilities, or do you want to move on? Okay, so everyone always says, time. We don't have the time to deal with research, right? Yeah. And so thinking through, looking through, Steve and I are reading all that, we're like, what do they really mean? Why? Why is time a barrier? Exactly what is it about time? So you look through and you're like, well, sometimes what they mean by time is they need the findings in time, right? We don't have time to wait for you researchers. You take forever. When you come to a conclusion, you say we need future research, right? So by the time you do that research, we may have gone on to the next project, similar to, I think, policy environments some of you are involved in. Other people, when they say I don't have enough time, their problem is their time is fragmented. So they can't sit down in the middle of a workday and try to absorb what it might take, beyond even the executive summary. It might be 3 to 5 pages. They don't have that time because it would take maybe half an hour, maybe an hour. Someone's always interrupting them. So no time for a lot of research, a lot of reading and sifting through things. You're just moving all the time. The other thing is thinking about, these are business people, right? Time is money. like, maybe I do have the time, but it's not worth my time to, what am I really going to get out of reading this study or trying to figure out this research finding? And my customers don't care, right? Some perceived customers don't value the research-based nature of the product or service, so it's not worth the time. So this is something new for you to think about. I do want to take just a minute and think through, okay, you've thought about the barriers and facilitators with respect to the strategies, with respect to what they think or how you could embed. What is the research that you're trying to embed into your KT strategy? So here you've got a bunch of people that you want to reach telling you, I don't have the time for you. So how is that going to inform your selection of a KT strategy? This side, we've already sort of talked about this, that people, I've heard in the small groups, people are aware that people think maybe other information is more important. I know in my gut when to hire people, I don't need any research. I use more boots on the ground stuff than looking to research. Next slide. So then we went through the transcripts and said, okay, what, no matter what we, given our, granted a loose definition of research, what are ways that people are accessing something, or at least ways that we could map our own, delivery of information onto the ways they're getting information? And again, I've heard some of the people talking about this in the small groups as a preference for data generated by in-house or highly trusted external sources, talking one-on-one, just picking up the phone. I have my expert, my subject matter specialist, other people in the business is the best information source. I don't like to read, I'd rather get it verbally. And people use email a lot. They like to get emails, maybe with the little executive summary and then the link to the report, despite, what you might think, given all the buzz about Web 2.0 and social media. So there's a lot of value for information channeled through trusted networks, professional networks, whether it be face-to-face email or listservs. Next slide. So social media, right? Did anyone start thinking, did you pick a social media? I know we're going to be talking later on in the morning about using Facebook for an audience of people who've had traumatic brain injury. Mm-hmm.
Second workshop?
After me, our friends from VCU were talking about Facebook. So most of the time when the employers talked about Facebook or YouTube, they are pushing information out through social media. They're not getting research in through social media. Maybe some people were a little more into it, so some individuals might have said that, but it wasn't going on an organization level. One person mentioned Twitter as a good way to publicize announcements, press releases, or snippets of information. But these were government or nonprofit employers, not industry. Next slide. So if you are going to do try to reach business through social media, LinkedIn would be the best tool to use. It was most often used as a source of research-based information. Someone said, well, it's kind of a first step, kind of a fishing trip, see what's going on out there about, this is kind of market research. I get a sense of different blogs, so it's kind of a first step. Next. Okay, so this is what this blue here, this third step in the theoretical domains framework that is outlined in that French article that you have in your folder. Which intervention components, behavior change techniques, and modes of delivery could overcome the modifiable barriers and enhance the enablers? So you've been thinking through this morning what you need, what your barriers and facilitators are. So that's like the crux of this, that if you're going to do a KT strategy, focus on those things, because that's what you need to have your intervention target, not just your audience, but how they do or don't consume research or lacking any consumption of research information generally. Does that make sense? Okay, next. So this is what we actually did, right? We have this systematic review that we had on cancer in the workplace. It found that most of the studies were actually based in hospitals, and if they did measure an employment outcome, that was not necessarily the focus of the study. And there was some preliminary work talking about teams of interdisciplinary, interprofessional team. So you would get the oncologist working with a VR professional, working with a physical therapist, and then ideally, if you could get a buy-in from the employer, translating that into some kind of employer component of this multi-component intervention. So as far as a research finding about cancer and workplace accommodations, there have been 2 systematic reviews now, one that Carlton Fung is the lead author, and I'm the second author on. It's in Campbell. And then in Cochrane, DeBoer did one in 2011, and they both found the same thing, that multi-component interventions work the best. So what do you do with that, given our KTER project? How are we going to, embed that in the KT strategy that we're mandated to do with employers? This is our assignment, right, from our funding agency. So we actually thought, we're going to have to narrow this down. We're going to have to make it more policy-oriented, because that's what the employers are going to need. If you're going to be, so thinking through like the implication of that finding is you really need more employers involved and more manager training, and this poises them to be involved in a multi-component intervention, because clearly their employees will already have at least an oncologist, right? So we decided that what we were going to focus on in our strategy was research findings presented along with information about recent amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So this is a couple of years ago. So the act was amended, as I think everybody knows, in 2008. And there was a lot of unease about what's going on. So there's already a little bit of an information demand for the ADA. So this is how we tried to address the barrier value for other kinds of information, and that they want timely information. So it's not necessarily a finding from a study, although it's a research-based outcome that we're looking for, as far as raising awareness and hopefully people using that awareness and knowledge to benefit their employees with cancer in the workplace. And what about this whole barrier about fragmented time? Well, we thought, well, we'll do a short webcast. That's a pretty common training strategy for employers. We'll archive it so they can have access to it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then we offered follow-up information to increase the intensity of the intervention, because people aren't necessarily totally paying attention during a webcast. They're doing other things. So that we used a toolkit that the American Cancer Society had already published for managers, and we sent that out to everybody who participated in the webinar. As far as trying to get them to value this information, since their time is a scarce resource, and why would they want to invest time in our webinar, we related some information to the bottom line, in the sense that knowledge of this webcast was related to a legal mandate. So that was another reason why we focused on the ADA and the Family Medical and Leave Act and other policies. Next. So our facilitators, that whole compliance orientation, we thought, well, we don't want a researcher being our facilitator. So we are acquainted with Joe Bonke. He's a Houston area trainer for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, because we do work with the Southwest Americans with Disabilities Act Center, SWATA, and he's an affiliate there. And he actually already had a presentation on this topic, so he was happy to help us out. And then that whole issue about, someone in the corner there was talking about, well, I guess it was Jess, they want information related to their own company. So we said, okay, well, we're going to split this. The real strategy that we're going to test here, everyone's going to get the webinar, and then half of them are going to get the offer of technical assistance. So we'll say, hey, you can talk to Joe Bonke if you want, or here's the Job Accommodations Network. They'll help you out. And if you want to figure out, how do I use this webcast information in my company, these people will help you. Value for research-based employee training, we made sure that they were aware, right, of Joe Bonke's credentials, and we did offer human resource, and we are now starting to offer the CRC for the VR counselors. So we offered them credit as a kind of, so that, again, to make it more worth their time. And we did keep the focus on employees with cancer. I mean, there are systematic reviews that are pretty good about return to work for people with all conditions, but we thought we're just going to keep this as a cancer focused webinar. Next. Okay, so our research question was, does follow-up technical assistance offered to employers who attend a webinar and receive other informational resources about cancer survivors' employment issues and reasonable accommodations process help to sustain knowledge gains and promote application? Next. So this is getting us into, so this was the intervention that we came up with. So I don't know if you were getting to the point in your small group discussions where using the same data that we had to work with, did anyone say you were going to do a webinar or anything at all like this? Yeah. Go ahead and talk in the mic.
We said we would do a webinar for business, probably keep it about 45 minutes and archive it so they could go back and listen to it later. And then also thought about where else do they get information, like maybe practitioner journals as opposed to academic journals, to say they might be reading those already, so let's put information in places where they already go.
Okay. What other, did anyone else think of an intervention, get that far in the discussion, or not really?
We talked about taking things down to the infographic level.
Mm-hmm.
Quick, easily digestible, easily shareable, and hopefully intriguing enough to engage them into signing up for the webinar or finding out more.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to a training May 20th to learn how to do that. Anything radically different? Or maybe, as I say, maybe you didn't get that far. Okay. So, as I said, I've just presented you. This is what we decided would be a good idea to do. And so the fourth part of theoretical domains framework is thinking through how behavior change can be measured and understood. So this is also obviously a key thing for KT, as opposed to, I know Hannah Redstrom uses the phrase, the spray and pray method. So we don't want to just spray and pray. We're going to try to figure out what kind of impact are we having. So that's essential to knowledge translation. Next. So our measures were pretty simple. We're a small project. I'm not necessarily convinced these are the best measures, but this is what we did given the resources that we had. We did a pre-post test of knowledge. It was criterion-based. So we worked with Vin Wen at the ADA Center and Joe Bonke, and so we had a 14-item test talking about the content of the webinar, the ADA and the Family Medical and Leave Act, the FMLA. So we did that as part of registration. If people opted into the study, they or if they wanted the credit, they did that. And then within 3 days, they got the post-test with the link to the American Cancer Society Toolkit. And then 3 months after someone submits a post-test, they get that same check for knowledge retention. And then there's 2 general questions about behavior change. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it's a Likert scale, and you either, it's from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I did something differently as a result of the information I learned in this webcast or the follow-up information, or my company did something different. So we didn't make it any more specific. I'll talk about why when you see the data. Next. So this is how we did. People like the webinar, so we got 267 people to register for the live webinar, 53 for the archive. They don't like being in studies.
Well, I'm shocked.
Right, exactly. So we only got 109 to enroll in the study at registration. This was back in July 23rd, and we have picked up some people through the archive. And again, as you know, I think some of you in the room, you host an event, everybody signs up, well, something comes up. So not only do they not like being in studies, they don't necessarily want to go to the webinar that they said something comes up. So then we lost more attrition. But we did get in 41 post-tests after the July webinar, and we've been able to track 33 of them and get those 3-month follow-ups. We've picked up a few through the archive. Some of them are still in the system. This is not final project data, because for our power analysis, we need to have 76 people go through all 3 of these knowledge and behavior checks. But we're getting there. So I'm going to show you what we know so far from these data. Next. So the incentive. right? If you're going to do a KT strategy, is it worthwhile to offer this kind of training incentive? These are not statistically significant patterns, but still, if you look at that bar chart, just on the face of it, if you can do it, sure. I mean, we did get better retention from the people who wanted the credit because they need to do it to get the credit. Next. Now let's think through, okay, who are we dealing with? Who showed up? Who was the focus groups? Who was involved in the focus groups? And who actually were we able to recruit to this webinar? Now, everyone's an employer, but the people who were in the focus groups, there were more people from private industry there. We had, we still had a range of company sizes. As you can see, it's got a lot of pieces, that pie chart, and they're not that different. So we had, large companies, 41%. I mean, you can look at the slide yourself. So there was a range of sizes. Next. But look at industry, okay? We got a ton of government people to show up for this. So they're employers, but it's not really business, right? So these are people who are interested in the ADA and the EEOC who are showing up to get extra training, right? And then some people work in services. Other was a real mix of different industries. Next. So when you look at that occupation professional specialty, some of them are ADA trainers. Some of them are, management. And to opt into the study, you had to be a supervisor, because otherwise we thought, what's the point of the behavioral change if you can't do anything with this information with an employee? Next. So here are the pre-post and the post follow-up scores. There was, just some gains. However, people already knew a lot coming into the webinar. So they did learn something in the webinar. They did retain. They didn't retain from the follow-up score. See, there was a drop from, so the pre is 11.39 coming in on this 14-point scale. The post is 12.53. But then it went from, see, we only have 39 posts, so that's why the mean is different. So the post is 12.69, and then the follow-up dropped a bit. But really, when you look at it, the range of those means is minuscule, right? We're going from 11.79 to 12.53. So it's not a giant effect size that we're having with this webinar. Next. So did the offer of TA make a difference? Not really, because, moving on. This is when we, now in hindsight, we focused on just cancer. Okay, so cancer is a very common condition. I'm sure everyone in this room knows someone with cancer, or has, not everyone in the room has had cancer, but very prevalent. But here you are, there's a range of employer sizes. So what are the chances that in the 3 months that we're checking that you are going to have an employee with cancer, right? Why would you, for the offer of TA, you're not going to call up Joe Bonnke or use the Job Accommodations Network if you don't really need to, right? You're not necessarily going to say, oh, I have some follow-up questions in general, hypothetically, about this webinar. So we didn't get a lot of reported behavioral changes. People were kind of neutral. It's like, well, it was good. But just a couple of people needed to use the follow-up technical assistance. Next. And a couple I'm using colloquially, right? So we are going to do, they also didn't explain a lot. They filled in the Likert scale, but we didn't get a lot of comments. So we don't know. I mean, there were some people saying, yes, I strongly agree, I did something differently. The comments said, well, I'm more careful with confidentiality now with employee data. So they were, thinking through what they learned about employees with cancer and realizing this is true for all of my employees with disabilities. Because Joe Bonnke really stresses the importance of separate files, that the accommodation information needs to be separate from the employee file, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. So right now, for next steps, we're conducting follow-up interviews with those who reported they did change some behavior to figure out what did you do. And we're expanding the selection criteria to include vocational rehabilitation counselors, which is another one of our target audiences for the KTER Center, and adding a CRC credit as an incentive. Next.
I have a quick question.
Sure. Uh-huh.
What would you have considered the ultimate best outcome of what you did?
I mean, the ultimate best outcome was that somehow we got the supervisors who did have employees with cancer and were struggling with that, and they reported, oh, I gave that person an accommodation.
Okay.
So just some thoughts. Importance of context of decision making. If you're thinking through your own KT models, well, in what context is your individual member of your target audience needing to make that decision? So it needs to be something where you're thinking through it's a realistic need. They actually do probably have a need for this information within the time that I'm going to measure my outcomes, right? So they are the related importance of longer term follow up. I think if we continue to follow these people, sure, eventually, particularly at the larger employers, someone is going to have cancer and need you to act on this information that you got in this webinar. This, I think, and we just went through designing a new study, and I put in measuring behavioral intent because we're missing that, right? So people may have thought, I didn't even know that cancer was a disability under the ADA. I don't know so much about the people who showed up at our webinar. It seemed like they already had a lot of knowledge of the ADA. But think through that so that you won't, at the end of your study, have anemic data that just shows, well, we don't really know, right? So at least you could see, I would like to use this information, right? And if you're going to do something with employers, think through, like for KTER Center, we just needed employers. We didn't have to have private industry. If you do, well, put that in your selection criteria, right? An employer is not an employer is not an employer. It actually is a member of the business community that you're trying to reach. So that's my song and dance for today. I don't know, does anyone have a comment they want to use the mic, please?
Excuse me.
Uh-huh.
When you speak to the fact that in this particular thing you were looking at, obviously the issue of cancer as the focus, but do you see the transferability of that in a broader sense? Because, and here's why I ask that, is if it's behavioral intent, it's like, do you like to deal with everything as a crisis? Because the issue of cancer can very much present itself that way in an employment situation versus, disability as a part of, one's life experience, and that there can be, situations that will change in the employment situation or in the hiring situation. See what I mean? There's sort of a difference because I think with some employers, certainly when I've talked to HR people, they sort of think of their life as crisis. I mean, gotta fire somebody. And then there's the routine stuff. We do salary studies. We do all of this. And because I'm a lawyer in training by my background, you like to work with clients about it's not always a crisis. We can plan, and let me explain to you the crisis that will happen. And that's sort of a negative take on the beginning. And I often wonder about this in our research. I don't want to lead people into that negative belief. But the cancer situation, in a way, that's how it often shows itself. It's a crisis, and you want to be able to deal with it not as a crisis, but as a part of your business.
Absolutely. Training as emergency management.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, maybe we use those allegories or metaphors.